spiritual message of yoga for humanity. Swamiji was the pioneer of scientific research in yoga in the world, and it all started 97 years ago here in Kevalyadham, Lonavala.
In Swamiji's words, the principal ideal of Kevalyadham is the coordination of the spiritual phenomena of yoga with modern science, with a view to evolve a philosophy that would perhaps satisfy the majority of mankind. Swamiji started the journal Yog Mimamsa in 1924, and we are proud to say that it is still in print as well as available online with the latest scientific as well as philosophico-literary research in the field of yoga.
In this scientific session, we will be discussing the research and application of yoga in various mental health related problems. Our speakers for the session are Dr. Chris Streeter, Dr. Helen Lavretsky, Dr. Rima Dada, and Dr. Catherine Cook-Cottone, and our session chair, Dr. Satbir Singh Khalsa ji. I request Dr. Prasida Menon to receive the certificates of appreciation on behalf of our speakers and request Dr. Bhalekar, Principal of Gordhan Das Saxaria College, to do the honors and felicitate our panelists. Thank you. We'll now introduce our speakers. Dr. Chris Streeter. Dr. Chris Streeter is an associate professor of psychiatry and neurology at Boston University School of Medicine in USA. She's an instructor at Harvard Medical School and a research associate at the McLean Hospital. Dr. Chris is the director of functional neuroimaging for the Department of Psychiatry at the Boston University School of Medicine. She has over 20 years of NIH-funded research and has served as the principal investigator for a number of studies. Her current area of research focuses on the effects of yoga-based practices on brain GABA, the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter, mood, and heart rate variability.
Next, our speaker is Dr. Helen Lavretsky. Dr. Helen is a professor in residence in the Department of Psychiatry at University of California and a geriatric integrative psychiatrist with a federally funded research program in geriatric depression and integrative mental health using mind-body interventions. She is a recipient of the Career Development Award from the National Institute of Mental Health and the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health.
Our next speaker is Dr. Rima Dada. Dr. Rima is presently a professor at AIIMS, New Delhi, where she has established the Molecular Reproduction and Genetics Facility, a fellow of the National Academy of Medical Sciences, International Medical Science Academy, Academy of Standards and Ratings, and the Indian Academy of Biomedical Sciences. She has, over the last 10 years, been working on the impact of yoga on the genome and epigenome, while continuing to be actively engaged in teaching, research, and genetic diagnostic services. And our last speaker for this session is Dr. Catherine Cook-Cottone. Dr. Cottone is a psychologist, yoga therapist, and professor at the University at Buffalo, State University of New York. She has written 8 books and over 75 research articles and chapters on mindful self-care, embodiment, self-regulation, eating disorders, and trauma. She is co-founder of the Yogis in Service and researches and consults with the Africa Yoga Project and the United Nations Foundation to develop and deliver trauma-informed, mindfulness-based resilience training for yoga teachers and humanitarian workers in North America, Africa, and the Middle East. We welcome all our speakers. The session chair for this discussion is Dr. Satbir Singh Khalsa. Dr. Khalsa is the Director of Yoga Research for the Yoga Alliance and the Kundalini Research Institute and an Assistant Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. Dr. Khalsa has been with us earlier this morning for his plenary talk, and we welcome him again. Dr. Khalsa has also been attending every session of this conference, and I believe since he's been with us in the morning, he hasn't slept all night. I hope you are well, Dr. Khalsa. The session is over to you now.
Thank you very much, and it's wonderful to have this panel as part of this conference. I think you'll find that all of our speakers are remarkable scientists and yoga researchers. They are all definitely well published in the field of yoga research, and they are leaders in this field as well. And I think you'll find that their insights and their work has really revealed how yoga can really play an impact. And we'll hear about mechanisms underlying, in fact, how yoga is impacting these different mental health conditions. So our first speaker in this panel is Dr. Chris Streeter. And ironically, Dr. Streeter and Dr. Cook-Cottone, we are all in Massachusetts. We are all about 25 miles apart. So we are all coming, many of us are coming to you from Massachusetts. So Dr. Streeter, please go ahead, share your screen, and you are welcome to take the podium and give your presentation.
Well, good afternoon, I think, for you. It is good morning for us. I am really delighted and honored to have had the opportunity to participate in this conference, and I am very sorry that I can't be there with you in person. I want to say that I have no conflicts to report, and I have to say that in the U.S., yoga is not an approved treatment for depression, which is why it's a research issue. And I want to be grateful for the funding that we have received from the Veterans Administration, from the National Center of Complementary and Integrative Health at NIH, and from Boston University. So balance is very important, and Western models talk about homeostasis, which is the range that you're supposed to stay in. Allostasis is very helpful because it's a range that's outside of homeostasis, that we can go in when there's a stress. Allostatic load is what the body acquires when you stay in allostasis, an extended period of time. In chronic or lifestyle choice diseases is what you get when you have allostatic load over a period of time. So examples are, if you are threatened, it is very helpful to be able to increase your heart rate and increase your cortisol levels in response to an acute stress. However, we have chronic stress, and that leads to increased cortisol, increased weight, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, and cardiac morbidity, none of which are very good for you. So there is a Zen saying that is 7 times down and 8 times up. So everybody has adversity in life, and it's really how you respond to the adversity that makes the difference. And the hypothesis is that yoga-based practices increase resilience and lead to the ability to return to homeostasis or balance. And I use yoga-based practices very broadly. So I'm going to talk to you about what we would call vagal GABA theory that predicts that yoga practices would be associated with increased parasympathetic input into the central nervous system through the myelinated vagal nerve, increased GABA aminobutyric acid, which I'm going to call GABA activity, and that's the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in mammals. And that is going to be associated with improved mood and decreased anxiety. So autonomic imbalance. So most people think of the autonomic nervous system as having both a sympathetic nervous system and a parasympathetic nervous system. And when we are stressed, there's usually too much sympathetic activity and too little parasympathetic activity. And this type of imbalance is associated with negative emotions. And this is probably the link between negative emotions and poor health. Steve Porges developed what's called polyvagal theory, where the vagus is split into an unmyelinated vagus that is slow, and then you have the sympathetic nervous system, and then it goes to a myelinated vagus that is fast. So just to review the anatomy, if the neuron has a myelin sheath, the nerve can transmit from node of Ranvier to node, so it is much faster from here to here. It's much faster than an unmyelinated nerve. And an example would be if you stub your toe, you know right away that you stubbed it. And then just a little bit later, you feel the pain. And so where you stubbed it is a myelinated sensory fiber that is fast. And then there's unmyelinated C-pain fibers that are slow. And so that's the difference between a myelinated and an unmyelinated nerve in the peripheral nervous system. This is a schema of the autonomic nervous system. The green is the parasympathetic and the red is the sympathetic system. And the point of the slide is the major organs, heart, lungs, GI tract, all receive input from both the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system, which helps you regulate what the body is doing. For our purposes, we're going to look at the heart. And the heart has the SA node here, the sinoatrial node, which is the pacemaker of the heart. And it has input both from the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system. This is an EKG. The tall waves are called the R waves. And we measure heartbeats by R waves. And we also measure what's called the RR interval, or the space between the R waves. And we have to understand that heart rate and heart rate variability are associated, but they are different. Heart rate is the average number of beats per minute, but heart rate variability is based on the actual space or time between each R wave, which can be just a little bit different. So sleep portraits also has what's called the vagal brake. So if your heart didn't have any input from the sympathetic or the parasympathetic system, it would beat at about 100 beats per minute. But it does not do that because the vagus is sitting on the SA node. And if the vagal input increases, it's called pushing down on the brake and your heart rate decreases. So vagal syncope is your heart rate goes way down, the blood doesn't get to your head, and then you pass out. So if you want to increase vagal tone, you let up on the input to the SA node. So the vagal brake is the most efficient way to regulate heart rate if you're under 100. And heart rate variability is controlled, if it's high, it's controlled by the myelinated vagus because it's the only nerve that is fast enough to do that. So we use heart rate variability as a marker of parasympathetic tone. So the general rule is low heart rate variability is bad. It implies decreased flexibility and is an overall marker of mortality. That is across the board. So very important observation. The other side is high heart rate variability is good, and it implies increased flexibility and resilience. So for yoga practices, the easiest way to follow this into the nervous system is through breathing. And the point of this slide, it shows that in the top left corner, when people are breathing at 5 breaths per minute, the heart rate varies between 93 and 60. There's a lot of variation if you're breathing slowly. When you breathe in, it's like a dinner bell. The lungs have oxygen. It's like, come and get it. So your heart rate goes up. And when you exhale, your heart rate goes down. Now, if you're breathing at 7.5 breaths per minute, there's less variability in the heart rate and less heart rate variability. When you're at 15 breaths, which might be around where a lot of people are when regularly, it then goes, the heart rate, change in heart rate goes down even more. And when you're anxious or having difficulty breathing at 30 breaths per minute, there's really very little variability in your heart rate, which implies there's not a lot of flexibility in the system. So this is a great example. This is a study by Bernardi, and he took the rosary, which is when people repeat the Ave Maria. And if you do that 50 times in Latin, it's about 6 breaths per minute. Then he took a Hindi chant, Om Mani Padme Om, and they also did that at 6 breaths per minute. So 2 different religions, 2 different chants. However, the body is saying the same breathing rate. Top left shows how respirations are spontaneous breathing, and you can see with both the mantra and the Ave Maria, the respiration rate decreases. Bottom left is the heart rate variability with spontaneous breathing. And then you can see, actually the RR interval changes. And then you can see that it goes up with both the mantra and the Ave Maria. So both of these practices are having the same effect by increasing the RR interval, which increases heart rate variability. So historically, this is actually, I find interesting. So the rosary was introduced to Europe by the Crusaders. The Crusaders got it from the Arabs, and the Arabs got it from the yoga masters of India. So all those prayer beads and all those different cultures show that a lot of different people have found that these types of practices are helpful. So slow breathing with exhalation greater than inhalation is found to be beneficial for your mood, which is also what singing is. This is also from Steve Porges, and it is helpful because people can remember this. It's like a stoplight. So a green light would mean you're feeling safe, you have time to be mindful, socially engaged, and that's a myelinated vagus state. The yellow light is this more danger, you're kind of evaluating the situation. That's a sympathetic nervous system state. The red light is life threat, dissociative freeze, and that's an unmyelinated vagal state. So when people dissociate, small children, it's frequently they're getting abused, they'd like to get out of the room, they really can't, so they dissociate. So when we see dissociation in psychiatric illness, we really have to look for trauma. People who are being assaulted or raped, they may freeze. It's not like they want to be assaulted, it's that their body has decided that that's the best way for them to survive. Another way to look, and that's an unmyelinated vagal state. The other thing to remember is reptiles do not have a myelinated vagus. They only have an unmyelinated vagus. And so when they die, they evacuate their bowel and bladder. So when people pee their pants or poop their pants, that means that they are thinking that they're in a life-threatening situation. And I have several cats. One is a very good mouser, and I found him playing with something. And I looked and it was this little mouse all curled up, and I thought it was dead. So I swept it up into the dustpan and I was taking it outside. And then as soon as I got outside, it woke up and escaped. So that type of behavior was very helpful, but it's not very flexible. So when you're in a myelinated vagus state, it really helps you be able to have emotional regulation, autonomic regulation. It's for self-soothing, and self-regulation, which is this internal locus of control that a lot of yoga practices help people to develop. And this myelinated vagal state is associated with optimal mental health and optimal physical health. And one of the things to remember that healthy elderly almost always have a fairly large social engagement network. So you have to remember that we are social primates. Humans are designed to interact with other humans. We do better with that, which is why COVID has been very hard on us because it's made us socially isolated. However, some people don't get along well with other people, and some people don't have a lot of other people in their lives. So having a cat, a dog, or a horse, which is a mammal that has a myelinated vagus that they can relate to, is very helpful for them as self-regulation and self-soothing. Sorry, I did that. So the point of this slide is that yoga-based practices can help move people into this myelinated vagus state, which makes better for their overall health, decreases stress, anxiety, and also improves their ability for social interaction. I'm switching now to the next stage of the theory, which is GABA aminobutyric acid, which I'm going to call GABA. It is the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter in animals. It is present throughout the neural axis. And there's GABA A and GABA B receptors, and we say GABA A is for alcohol because the GABA A receptors are also where alcohol and benzodiazepines work. We use magnetic resonance spectroscopy, which we get using an MRI machine to measure GABA levels. And there are studies that show that in depression, anxiety, and epilepsies, GABA levels are decreased. Pharmacologic agents that increase the activity of the GABA system are used to treat depression, anxiety, and epilepsy. And I will point out that epilepsy increases when people are under stress. So yoga has been shown to improve depressive symptoms both when used alone and when used with antidepressants. Currently, pharmacological treatments for major depressive disorder leave about 40% of people still having symptoms. Current treatments for PTSD leave about 33% of individuals still having symptoms. That's not very good. Exercise has been shown to decrease depressive and anxiety symptoms, and that is why we use it as an active control in our study. And then people want to know, well, what's the best intervention? And the answer is the one the person likes, because they're not going to do it if they don't like it. We've done 7 studies with experienced practitioners, healthy controls, people who are depressed, dosing studies, and we're now doing one in veterans. This is a slide from the first study, and this is the spectral data that we get when we do spectroscopy, and GABA is this very little peak. And the area under the peaks are associated with how much whatever it is we're measuring. So for a peak to increase, that means there's more of whatever it is. So in the top left, you can see the GABA peak here. This is in a yoga practitioner that had to be doing yoga 3 times a week for 3 months. Many of them were yoga instructors. And then you can see in the bottom right, after doing 15 minutes of yoga postures only, the GABA peak has increased. So this was the first evidence that yoga was associated with an increase in GABA levels. And I say associated because we can't say for sure whether it's causal, although we think so. And I put this slide in because I think there are a number of yoga teachers in the audience. And the point is this first study, I just took all comers. And so Ashtanga, Iyengar, Vinyasa, Kundalini, Hatha, Bikram, and Power, although this was not done in a hot room, were all present, which implies that it doesn't really matter as far as the postures are concerned what practice you're doing. This is a general scheme of how we do the studies. We screen the people, we bring them in for imaging session 1. They get randomized to a 12-week intervention. We bring them in for imaging session 2. After the 12 weeks, they get out, they do whatever intervention we've assigned them to, usually yoga or walking. We have also done a dosing study. And then they have scan 3. And then before each scan, we do mood scales and we get an EKG for heart rate variability. This is one of the dosing studies. The blue line is our Beck's Depression Inventories, which is a scale for depressive symptoms. The higher the number, the more symptomatic. So people are going from about 27 down to about 7. That's a significant decrease, and then clinically they're not depressed anymore. So as their depressive symptoms are going down, their cumulative yoga minutes in the study is going up. It's very clear inverse proportion between the more yoga they were doing, the less depressed they were getting. This is again the spectral data, and the blue hump is at scan 1, showing GABA levels are the lowest. At scan 2, they've gone up, and then immediately after an intervention, they go up even more. So this is the data in an individual, and we collect the data in the thalamus because there's a lot of neurons there, and it's technically easy for us to get high-quality data. These are the mood scales that go with it, and the point is, and the black one is for a high-dose group 3 times a week, and the lighter one is for a low-dose group 2 times a week, that they both are being more positive, more revitalized, more tranquil, significant increases in both. So after 40 minutes of yoga, they feel they're less physically exhausted. They have decreased anxiety, decreased depression, and this has improved sleep. And so they're all going the right way. This slide compares somebody in that study who's depressed to a healthy control in black. And the point is that the red is comparable to the black one, meaning that the people who had low GABA levels who were depressed that increased over the course of the study were moving towards the level of someone who is normal, or what we would call homeostasis. So they're moving from allostasis to homeostasis. This is when we take them and average them together. So the blue again represents depression, and it is slowly marching up. And the reds, there's not a significant difference between these. And the point is these two are significantly different, but these two at scan 3 are not significantly different, again, with the whole group moving towards being normal over the course of the study. So there are a lot of disorders that have both low heart rate variability and low GABA activity, including depression, alcohol dependence, and a variety of anxiety disorders. So this is a Venn diagram, and we kind of show that these things are overlapping, but it's not just coincidentally overlapping, I would argue. I would argue that all of this is related to stress, that is making this autonomic imbalance with too much sympathetic and too little parasympathetic, and that's associated with too little GABA activity, and then it presents as these various disorders depending on who you are, and they are extremely comorbid. I've seen a lot of people that have all 4 of these diagnoses. This is a slide of the last study that we completed, and it's looking at the Beck's Depression Inventory, which is a symptom of depression, and a PCLC checklist, which is symptoms for PTSD. And this was with people who were depressed, with randomized to yoga or walking. Both of them have significant decreases in depressive symptomatology. Both of them have significant decreases in post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms. The yoga group is a little bit better than the walking group. This is a small study, so you would think that it might be significant if it was the larger study. So in summary, homeostasis and allostasis, balance versus imbalance, yin versus yang, there are all different ways to look at how a system can be balanced. And when different philosophies, Eastern philosophy and Western philosophies, are right, then there really should be no conflict, which is what we're finding as we become more sophisticated. And I'm going to thank you for your attention, and I'm going to say that the black cat is the one that is the good mouser. And we'll take, I think, questions at the end. Is that right, Satbir?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Streeter, for that excellent presentation that gave us a lot of insights into not only the therapy of yoga as a potential for major depressive disorder, but also insights into the underlying mechanisms. Our next speaker is Dr. Helen Lavretsky. She's not able to join us live for her presentation, but we have a recording of her presentation. So I would ask the organizers to go ahead and play that recording of her lecture.
Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this very important topic, dear to my heart. I am Helen Lavretsky. I'm a professor of psychiatry and director of a late life mood, stress, and wellness research program, integrative mental health and well-being program, and post-COVID research and clinical program at the University of California, Los Angeles. It's an honor to be here. This is to acknowledge my funding sources, the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, from which I receive a career award, assisting in mentoring others who are interested in integrative mental health. And the Alzheimer's Research and Prevention Foundation that funded most of my yoga studies, as well as to acknowledge a couple of books, Complementary and Integrative Therapies for Mental Health and Aging, that I edited, Resilience and Aging, Research and Practice, and Convergence Mental Health, a recently released book that looks forward to the next decade of transdisciplinary innovation in mental health. So to state the obvious, and this is pre-pandemic numbers, the state of global unhealth. 450 million people suffered from mental or behavioral disorder. 1 million commit suicide every year. Neuropsychiatric disorders are responsible for 4 out of 6 leading causes of years lived with disability. A quarter of all families have at least one member with mental disorder, and global cost of mental illness pre-pandemic was in the single-digit trillions, anticipated to increase by 2030, but the pandemic really will result in much accelerated rate of these numbers. It is compounded by population aging globally, especially in the developed countries, and with children under 5 number decreasing and people living longer, 65 and over, increasing. So by 2050, it's really unclear where the resources will come from and who will take care of the aging population. And that certainly play a role and in the consequences of the pandemic, because older adults had been most vulnerable victims of it. The toll of the pandemic and generally mass disasters is well known. It's been studied, especially in the climate-related disasters, where people react, they mobilize in the first couple of months of the mass disaster to come together and help each other. But then the chronic stress of consequences of dealing with pandemic and restrictions and isolation sets in. People who had pre-existing anxiety and depression and mental illnesses do overall worse than others because of the impaired resilience. So they go through phases of psychological response that leads with the chronic stress to psychological trauma, mental illness, burnout, worsens new outbreaks, and they currently were dealing with the impact of interrupted care on chronic conditions. Multiple losses ensue, losses of loved ones, financial, jobs, fear of death and calamities, very pervasive. Social isolation and physical distancing, major disruptions of daily life and social connectedness, increase in alcohol and substance abuse, increase in suicides, including in healthcare workers. COVID itself is associated with long haul or post-COVID neuropsychiatric symptoms that consist of prolonged many months post-acute COVID infections, symptoms that result in disability, fatigue, brain fog, cognitive impairment, chronic malaise, anxiety, depression, PTSD, increased suicidality, psychosis and delirium, and dysautonomia, which is unexplained fluctuations in heart rate and blood pressure, resulting in ER, emergency room admissions. No wonder individuals and the general public wonder how to control their own reactions, how to control their own environment given all this environmental stresses. So the public has been using it for a long time, and the use is really accelerated in the recent time. Mind-body medicine really could serve a purpose here, and yoga belongs to it, as well as other interventions like meditation, Tai Chi, expressive arts, hypnotherapy, guided imagery. And here where it intervenes is at stress response, which is an evolutionary response that is built into all of us, except it's modified by our individual differences, genetic, developmental experiences, chosen lifestyle, like diet, smoking, drinking, sleep, exercise can modify it. And then generally we are built to adapt to any situation. And that process of that adaptation is called allostasis, keeping everything steady despite stress or adversity. But when the stress becomes too much, too long, too strong, too chronic, we develop a maladaptive reaction called allostatic load, which is associated with increase in the blood pressure, systolic and diastolic, obesity, increased cholesterol, hemoglobin, cortisol, norepinephrine, epinephrine, HDL, and DHEAS, which are protective substances, go down. And all of our systems, brain, autonomic nervous system, neuroendocrine, and immune system, are involved in stress response and mobilize our body to respond to acute stress by running away or freezing or to avoid extreme stress. Multiple chemicals are released during that time. Our mind-body therapies are best intervening at this different levels of stress response. They could intervene, like mind-body therapists would intervene at the brain, autonomic nervous system, and other neuroendocrine systems and immune pathways. And acupuncture could be a more peripheral. Vagus nerve stimulator are examples of more peripheral action. There are resilience building interventions that can boost resilience to adversity and involve psychotherapy, like well-being therapy, learned optimism, hardiness training, all of which focus on positive aspects of difficult experiences, thereby promoting positive perception of challenges. And that has been quite pervasive in the spiritual communities, that we all can learn from the difficulties. Lifestyle factors, if they're chosen properly, healthy diet, exercise, sleep, spirituality, can enhance resilience by rebalancing physical and mental conditions. Complementary alternative and integrative medicine enjoy holistic approach to wellness, whole person approach, and encompasses various approaches to wellness and stress reduction. There are neuroimaging studies identifying biomarkers of or substrates of resilience, and those involve prefrontal cortex, hippocampus, amygdala, and anterior cingulate parts of the brain that are involved in the modulation of cognition and emotion. However, in older adults, cerebrovascular disease like small strokes and neurodegenerative changes represent risk factors undermining resilience in older adults. Hormones, as I mentioned before, and inflammatory mediators also change with stress, but also could be rebalanced by practicing mind-body therapies. Other neurotransmitters like BDNF, neuropeptide Y, are neuroplasticity protective factors. Genetic factors are ApoE4, which is a risk gene, allele, and a known risk factor for Alzheimer's disease and cerebrovascular disease, stroke. And other genetic variations can represent risk or resilience factors. Here in this paper that we published some time ago, we compared effects on the brain of mindfulness meditation versus yoga-based practices. And the affected portions of the brain are prefrontal cortex, as I mentioned, that is responsible for executive control and attention, anterior and posterior cingulate for mood regulation and memory, insula for sensory awareness of the self, of body, striatum for reward and learning and motivation, and amygdala for emotional processing. And mindful meditation affected 4 areas of the brain responsible for motor and emotional and somatosensory functions, resulting in greater awareness of self or increased consciousness. And yoga-based practices activated 7 areas of the brain responsible for judgment, discernment, memory, language, visual, spatial, and somatosensory functions, all of which could enhance judgment and self-control, self-regulation. So all of it could be used to treat stress resulted from COVID, but also post-COVID symptoms. Generally, it's been noted recently increase in acceptability of yoga and growth in the practitioners of yoga by 5% since 2012 to 2017, and a 3-fold increase in the same period of time in meditation. Women tend to practice more often, and younger adults prefer yoga, older adults prefer meditation. Cost effectiveness has been demonstrated for some yoga use in healthcare, for example, for musculoskeletal pain. Generally, people practice yoga to achieve wellness, improve immune function, improve job and athletic performances, and they achieve this outcomes, report better sleep, better emotionality, better self-control, better relationships, job performance. A challenge for yoga research is in enhancing physical and mental health associated with mass disasters, management of pain, depressive and anxiety symptoms, insomnia, cognitive symptoms and disabilities, and then have an impact on public health and prevention of diseases and disabilities especially. I've been at it for the past 15 years studying effects of yoga on disorders of aging. And here, yoga could be very helpful to increase musculoskeletal strength and flexibility, and that leads to improved balance and flexibility, reduced pain, breath awareness and control, improves cardiovascular and pulmonary function, concentration, attention, mindfulness, imagery, visualization, improves health, brain health, physical sensation and body awareness, improves mind-body connection, and all of it results in improved immune function, decreased inflammation, delayed aging, leads to support, greater support via psychosocial interaction. Generally, all these practices are practiced in groups. And that leads to self-empowerment, self-regulation, increased social support, and reduced loneliness. There's also shared environmental influences like vegetarian diet or sleep or lack of substance use, rituals, shared spirituality, beliefs, norms, and iconic teachers or gurus represent better lifestyle choices or examples of self-empowerment, leading to elevated consciousness and search for a better self. Biological mechanisms of yoga have been addressed. Streeters and colleagues found that yoga rebalances autonomic nervous system by upregulating parasympathetic nervous system and GABA system, which is a calming influence in the thalamus associated with improved mood. Hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis of stress results in reduction in cortisol. Review of 81 studies found that yoga surpasses aerobic exercise regimens. Numerous health outcomes like decreased cortisol, blood glucose, fatigue, pain, and sleep, improved sleep. Our studies found direct neuroplastic effects on the brain, connectivity, and region volume. With improvement in cognition, mental health, and resilience, and also changes in brain connectivity, favoring anti-inflammatory, antiviral expressions, improvement in cellular biomarkers of aging. So also what MindBody and other complementary and integrative therapies offer is the effect on cellular mechanisms of aging, reversing inflammation, senescence, mitochondrial function, epigenetic changes in the gene, telomeres that are biomarkers of aging, compression of morbidity, meaning that people just get healthier, and benefits to cardiometabolic, bone, and vascular health, and improved side effect profiles for older adults who take multiple medications. Yoga and cognition has been explored, not too many studies explore that, but yoga practice seems to be associated with moderate improvement in cognitive functioning. However, older studies have a shaky methodology and smaller sample size, heterogeneous populations, and various other downsides in terms of methods to interpret this with confidence. We conducted yogic meditation, 12 minutes a day for 8 weeks in stressed dementia caregivers, and measured all sorts of things like psychological distress, depression, anxiety, burden, resilience, cognition, and obtain various biomarkers like cytokines, cortisol, catecholamines, cognition, PET scan, fMRI, and NF-κB telomerase, and gene expression. And that's a chanting meditation, has a music behind, Satanama, and the mudra positions on each sound. And then imagination of, you imagine light, white light coming through the part of your brain, frontal part of the brain. And the reason I mention it, it's like multitasking that trains brain that we now see in on the MRI scan tracking brain activity. So generally, people who practiced yogic meditation, caregivers, improved in their depression, resilience, and cognition. And telomerase, which is a biomarker of aging, compared to people who were just asked to go and rest and listen to the music. Then we looked at the gene expression, and 64 genes changed their expression, which means we can change our nature by choosing different styles, lifestyles. And that resulted in 64 genes that downregulated inflammation. NF-κB is an inflammatory pathway, and upregulated interferon response factor, which is important for antiviral activity. Of course, also very important for COVID-related infections. And then in the brain, we found improvement in metabolism and also connectivity in the right inferior frontal area, which is related to multitasking or executive function. And comparing an fMRI of those who practiced kirtan kriya versus not, we found a greater activity and connectivity in the anterior cingulate orbito-insular network, which is a self-referential network where people are more aware of their body, mind-body connection. So here it was the first study, something like 12 years ago, that identified brain fitness of meditation, yogic meditation, increased self-awareness, shift in consciousness. I can change my life and can improve my health regardless of the circumstances. They were still stressed by caregiving, but they were able to improve their body function. And then curious effect of yoga on brain and memory was not something that was contemplated at that time when we did the study. We decided to pursue it in older adults with mild cognitive impairment, and 2 found improvement in cognition, memory, executive function, depression, and resilience, more so than memory training, which was a control condition. Yoga is in red, so it goes improves steadily over the course of 6 months follow-up. We looked at the connectivity in these areas, hippocampus and anterior cingulate, and the red dots represent the graphs, points of the graphs, and found that both yoga and memory training were correlated with cognitive performance, memory performance, but yoga was more significantly so. And yoga also increased choline changes in the hippocampus, and memory training decreased it. However, bilateral hippocampus volume was increased with memory training, but not with yoga. So both yoga and memory training had some effect on structures of the brain responsible for cognition. We just finished another study of women with risk factors for dementia, cardiovascular risk factors, and memory complaints, where yoga protected from gray matter loss in the brain across different areas, blue, in blue, light blue, and dark blue, while memory training participants declined over time. So yoga is really a very potent exercise. Even brief practices can lead to improvement in memory, executive function, mood, resilience, and really change the brain composition and function and chemistry. So acceptability is improved with use of non-pharmacological and spiritual interventions. I want to acknowledge again my collaborators and sponsors, especially my postdoctoral students who performed and wrote a lot of the experiments. And this is a golden temple in Amritsar, heart and soul of the Kundalini Yoga community. Thank you for your attention. Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak on this very important topic, dear to my heart. I am Helen Lavretsky. I'm a professor of psychiatry and director of a late life mood, stress, and wellness research program, integrative mental health and well-being program, and
it's being done to really show us mechanisms underlying the efficacy of yoga for mental health. Our next speaker is Dr. Rima Dada, who is based in New Delhi at the All India Institute of Medical Sciences. So I invite you to take over the virtual podium and share your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Khalsa, and thank you, the organizers, for inviting me to deliver this talk. And I would be sharing with you our work that we've done and how yoga can help in prevention and management of mental health problems. And my talk would focus on basically how mental health disorders are on the increase and why they are on the increase, and what is the role of paternal factors. And I've been working on male factor infertility, and though I would show you some of that data, because basically what I would like to highlight is how paternal factors are actually responsible for the steep increase that has occurred in mental health disorders. Then I would, since mental health disorders involve both the body as well as the mind, I would focus on how yoga is the best intervention for targeting these mental health disorders. I would also like to talk on how psychopathology emerges at different developmental neurotimes and how it occurs due to a complex interaction of nature, that is our genes, as well as the nurture, the environmental factors, and how the epigenome acts as the midpoint and is responsible for how it's so dynamic, and there's a change in gene expression because of various environmental factors like lifestyle, habits, emotion, and diet. I would also emphasize the importance of nutrition, because nutrition is one of the cheapest and one of the very effective modalities which can regulate our mental health and also influence the gut microbiome, which is the source of so many neurotransmitters critical for mental health, good mental health. Also, I would touch upon adverse childhood experiences, because these are also one of the factors which are responsible for an increase in the incidence of mental health disorders. And then how yoga and its 8 limbs, the Ashtanga yoga, how they can help us tackle all these modalities. For example, target the genome to prevent the decrease, improve the genomic integrity, modulate the epigenome, upregulate the expression of various genes which promote neuroplasticity, and also help to decrease the adverse childhood experiences when we follow the yamas and the niyamas, and also how our ahar would also help to improve the diet and more, have a healthy plant-based, unrefined, unprocessed diet, which would be very critical for our improvement in the mental health. So I would also like to introduce this concept that biological parenting begins much before conception, and it begins when parents themselves are conceived. The recent steep increase in the incidence of mental health disorders is largely blamed not only on the maternal factors which led to the concept of developmental origin of health and disease, but we find that there were a lot of paternal factors like paternal stress, smoking, excessive use of too much alcohol. It adversely impacted the germ cells, and this actually resulted in this concept of paternal origin of health and disease, that how our unhealthy lifestyles and social habits as well as the environmental factors actually impact our germ cells, and these germ cells then have an epigenetic mark which is transmitted to the offspring. And this is very critical, because normally before people plan to have a child, they improve their lifestyle, they stop smoking, and start a shift to a vegetarian diet. But it's important to remember that right from the time when they themselves are conceived, right from that time, the germ cells are actually accumulating every mark which they have experienced and the choices they have made and the stress they have gone through. There are numerous studies definitely there are studies which show that maternal stress, maternal high cortisol levels during pregnancy, and adverse childhood experiences of the mother do impact the fetus. But it's very important to remember that the father plays also a major role. And I'll show you by my studies on the sperm DNA, which we've done on infertile men, because that is the one with the highest levels of DNA damage and oxidative stress, how yoga can help. So there are numerous studies which show that now the concept, because people delay marriages and delay parenthood, increasing paternal age is associated with an increased risk of autism. Unhealthy lifestyle like fast food or food rich in trans fats, salts, and sugars is responsible for leaving epigenetic marks which result in aberrant methylation. Advanced paternal age also results in neurodevelopmental disorders because advanced paternal age is associated with mitochondrial dysfunction, and mitochondrial dysfunction results in more free radical production, which results in oxidative stress. And oxidative stress forms the interface between the nature and nurture, and it's been seen majority of the factors which actually impact the sperm genome or culminate in oxidative stress, which then results in DNA damage, and both to the genome and the epigenome. And paternal factors are also associated with an increased risk of schizophrenia and bipolar disorders. So you can see here, there are some very important studies which are featured in these journals, which show that fast food intake impacts the sperm epigenome and has resulted in and adversely affects the developing offspring. In addition to that, there are studies which show that there's a direct correlation with paternal adversity that they face. And for example, their exposure to various endocrine disrupting chemicals, drinking, smoking, and they have faced a lot of stressful periods during war, a high-fat diet, and chronic stress. They all result in cognitive impairment and a steep increase in the mental health disorders, which you can see in this last column. So, as there has been a delayed parenthood, we can see that as compared to the ova, it's the sperm which bears the maximum brunt. And I'll just tell you why. Because the sperm shows both epigenetic alterations as well as de novo mutations. And now I would just like to touch upon that there are a very important factor which is also playing a role in a steep increase in the mental health disorders are the adverse childhood experiences. And it has been seen that there are about 67% people who have at least one incidence of adverse childhood experiences, which results in a huge increase in the incidence of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, hepatitis, depression, and a 12-fold increase in suicides. So it is very, very important that if we have to focus on mental health, we have to pay a heed to our diet as well as to the adverse childhood experiences. And now I would like to just touch upon this impact, also the impact of nutrition on our mental health. And because nutrition is one of the important factors which actually regulates mental health, and there are numerous studies which have shown that when you have fast food, the next day the children have lower scores when they have tests as compared to children who have home-based, unprocessed, unrefined food. And an unhealthy diet, which is rich in trans fats, salts, and sugars, also causes dysbiosis and reduces the gut microbiota and its diversity, and is responsible again for an increase in the incidence of cognitive decline, attention deficit hyperactivity disorders, autism, and multiple sclerosis. So this is just summing up of our study at how sperm DNA can be affected. That the most important factors are, majority of these factors are modifiable and preventable if you lead a healthy lifestyle. So men need to be aware of this, that advanced paternal age, lifestyle factors like smoking, excessive alcohol intake, and increased intake of non-veg food, psychological stress, excessive use of cell phone, all culminates in oxidative stress, and oxidative stress damages both the nuclear and the mitochondrial DNA. Damage to the nuclear DNA results in fragmentation of the DNA, shorter telomeres, so accelerated aging, and also results in the accumulation of this oxidative DNA adduct. This DNA adduct, which I will show you how yoga impacts it, not only results in de novo mutations, but also epimutations, so negatively impacts the epigenome. And this results in genomic hypermutability and instability, which is responsible not only for infertility, recurrent miscarriages, but also for congenital malformations And the male genome is actually responsible for 75% of de novo germline mutations and is the cause for dominant genetic diseases as also complex neuropsychiatric disorders. So a steep increase in autism, attention deficit hyperactivity disorders, bipolar disorders, and schizophrenia are now correlated with sperm DNA being of poor quality. When I say sperm DNA, it is both the genome and the epigenome, which are targeted by these factors with the oxidative stress, which have resulted in a huge increase in the neuropsychiatric disorders. And as compared to other cells in the body, the sperm is the only cell which is not able to combat the oxidative damage that it suffers. So all the other cells, be it the oocyte or be it the other somatic cells, they are able to combat oxidative stress because they have a huge battery of antioxidants, but the sperm does not. It sheds majority of its antioxidants during its development, and majority of its DNA repair machinery is silent. Just two genes are active, which helps to just remove the base, but it depends upon the oocyte to clear its damage. So when there is a lot of DNA damage in the sperm, and there is advanced paternal age and maternal age, the oocyte is not able to clear the damage in the sperm. And therefore, this damage in the genome and the epigenome is passed on to the developing embryo and thus affects not only the embryonic physical health, but also the mental health. And this has been one of the key players in a steep increase in the incidence of autism, bipolar disorders, and childhood depression. And all the factors which are actually impacting the sperm DNA are factors which are related to our lifestyle, delayed age of marriage and parenthood, and so they are modifiable risk factors. And this is a landmark study by Dr. R. John Atkin from Australia, which is the Center for Excellence in Research, where he says that there are about 9,000 genomic loci in the sperm DNA, which are the hotspots which have consistent oxidative damage to their to those particular genes. And one of those genes that is a chromosome, which is a hotspot, is on the long arm of chromosome 15. And that is the region which is implicated both for infertility, cancers, genomic imprinting defects, as well as complex neuropsychiatric disorders. So we need to pay heed. So oxidative stress is impacting our mental health. And you can see here that oxidation of the sperm nucleus adversely impacts the sperm DNA, it impacts the oocyte and the development of the offspring. So our studies have shown that men have high levels of DNA damage, especially the people who are going in for assisted conception. And when I show you this data, these are men who have the highest level of DNA damage because of which they were infertile, and when they went in for assisted conception, they have repeated failures. But men who are having these children are having lower levels of this damage, but I would show you how yoga impacts both the genome and the epigenome. So both by comet assay as well as by sperm chromatin structure assay, we quantified the level of DNA damage, and we found that these men had higher levels of DNA damage. And then we quantified what is the type of damage. The chief cause of DNA damage in the sperm is oxidative damage. There are other causes, but they are the minor factors. The chief cause is oxidative damage, which occurs due to our unhealthy social habits like smoking, excessive alcohol intake, or exposure to insecticides and pesticides, which results in the accumulation of this base, which is the base which actually causes 8-hydroxy-2-deoxyguanosine, which induces both mutations and epimutations. And our studies have shown that the accumulation of this base results in de novo germline mutations and epimutations. And when they are not cleared by the oocyte, it results in post-zygotic mutations and epimutations, which is responsible for an increased burden of genetic and epigenetic diseases in the offspring. And no amount of antioxidants, actually, very few antioxidants are actually able to reach the sperm nucleus, and therefore the DNA damage tends to persist. And now we'll just discuss, and you can see that with advance in paternal age, not only is the incidence of these abortions, but autism also increases. And we've done a study in our lab where we found that with advanced paternal age, there is an increase in the incidence of autism, and there was differential methylation of various genes which were involved in developmental processes, synapse formation, sensory motor conduction, inflammatory pathways, and also involved in innate immunity. So now I would talk on how yoga can impact the sperm genome and the epigenome, and what is the implications on mental health. So you can see that when people do yoga, there's been a significant decline in the levels of oxidative stress. In addition to that, you can see that there's an increase in the total antioxidant capacity. These were randomized controlled studies. In the group that did not practice, you can see there was no change in the levels of the antioxidants. We also find that there was immune regulation and immune homeostasis, so it helped to decrease the inflammation. You can see here the level of this base, which induces both mutations and epimutations. As I told you, the 8-hydroxy-2-deoxyguanosine, the levels show a significant decline. So this is because there are decrease in the level of pro-inflammatory cytokines. There is an increase in the antioxidant capacity, because of which the oxidative damage to the sperm DNA decreases. This reduces both the rate of de novo germline mutations, because this is a pro-mutagenic base, and also epimutations. In addition to that, we did this study and we found that oxidative stress causes, it's been well known and documented, that oxidative stress causes global hypomethylation and locus-specific hypomethylation and imprinting defects. So post-yoga intervention, we can see that the methylation marks are reestablished. We find that there's an increase in the levels of 5-methylcytosine and decrease in the level of hydroxymethylcytosine, which is a product which is found after oxidative stress. In addition to that, we also find that a large number of genes which are helping in embryonic development, they show hypomethylation, which improve implantation, the embryo quality, show an upregulation post-practice of yoga. And this was the first study to show the impact of yoga on the sperm genome. And this correlated with the decrease in the DNA damage. And in addition to that, why I just brought this slide was to show you that oxidative stress occurs because of damage to the mitochondrial DNA. And this is also the first study to show that mitochondrial DNA integrity improves post-practice of yoga. So the free radical levels are decreasing now because of improvement in the mitochondrial integrity, and the ATP levels increase because there's an increase in the expression of various genes which help to maintain mitochondrial integrity. And in addition to that, the levels of NAD, which is a molecule which helps to maintain the nuclear and DNA crosstalk, the level increases, and so is the mitochondrial biogenesis improves. And in addition to that, we find that post-practice of yoga, the oxidative stress declines in about 10 days, but the DNA damage shows a significant decline post-practice of yoga for about 6 months. And here each dot represents the sperm, and the sperms which are towards the x-axis are the ones with the damaged DNA. And you can see that post-practice of yoga, there has been a significant decline in the sperm with the DNA damage. So now I would talk on, so this was how you can prevent mental health disorders by improving the DNA quality, because de novo germline mutations as well as epimutations are responsible for complex neuropsychiatric disorders. And now I would just talk to you about how yoga can help in management of depression, which is also, as WHO says, by 2030 would be the leading cause of global burden of disease and disability. So these were randomized controlled studies, and we found that post-practice of yoga, there were various factors which promote neuroplasticity showed a significant increase. For example, the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which promotes neurogenesis, neuronal survival, and maturation, helps in synaptic pruning, showed an upregulation. And this will help to actually change the function, physiology, as well as the anatomy of the brain, and increase gray matter in certain areas because it promotes neurogenesis, which are critical for our well-being. DHEA levels show an increase, and the serotonin levels also show an increase post-practice of yoga. And these are very important because a decline in the levels of serotonin are actually responsible for depression. And majority of the drugs which are sold off the counter are the selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and they have so many side effects. In addition to that, we found that melatonin, the molecule which helps to maintain the circadian rhythm, which is disrupted in people who have depression, its levels increase. And this also helps, not only is the circadian rhythm, they're able to sleep better because the sleep-wake cycle is maintained. In addition to that, it also helps to regulate your hormonal cycle because they are also released as per the circadian rhythm. And as also that melatonin is one of the most potent antioxidants, and the highest levels are found in the mitochondria. An increase in the melatonin levels also is responsible for improvement in the mitochondrial integrity. In addition to that, we find that the stress levels show a steep decline. The longevity hormone, the histone deacetylase, like sirtuin ones, show an upregulation. The inflammatory markers like IL-6, which is associated with depression, stress, and anxiety, show a downregulation post-practice of yoga. And the cytochrome oxidase levels show an increase, showing an improvement in the mitochondrial integrity. And we can see that oxidative stress levels have gone down. There has been a decline in the level of oxidative DNA damage because it's known now that depression is actually associated with accelerated aging because of damage to the DNA and shorter telomeres. But we find that post-practice of yoga, there is an increase in the telomerase levels and activity, and there is maintenance of the telomere length. And irrespective of the genotype, we found that those people who practice yoga, they had a higher rate of remission as compared to the group that was just on the antidepressant drugs. We also did a microarray analysis, and we found that various genes helping in immune regulation, various genes helping to maintain the circadian rhythm, and various tumor suppressor genes which maintain their genomic integrity showed an upregulation as compared to the groups which were just on antidepressant drugs. In addition to that, I wanted to show you not only the cases with major depressive disorders, yoga is also beneficial in cases of comorbid depression, as we can see that as the disease activity score also declined in a major autoimmune disease, we also find that there was a decrease in the severity of depression. And all 4 domains of quality of life showed an improvement post-practice of yoga. So I would just like to sum up by telling you that yoga is an art of living and it modulates the internal pharmacy. As I told you that there are various factors which have resulted in a steep increase in mental health disorders like a diet which was a calorie-dense diet, which is an unhealthy diet. If you follow the 8 limbs of yoga and follow a healthy ahar, that is a diet rich in unprocessed fruits, vegetables, and a plant-based diet. If you have a good code of conduct, personal as well as how you behave with others, you could reduce the incidence of adverse childhood events. And by practicing yoga, doing pranayama and meditation, you can actually improve both the genomic integrity, reduce the number of de novo germline mutations, positively modulate the epigenome to upregulate expression of genes which promote neuroplasticity, decrease inflammation, and switch on gene programs which are beneficial for health. And this would help to improve both the mental and the physical health. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dada, for that exhaustive presentation with enormous amounts of molecular information that I'm sure are really quite eye-opening to anyone who understands these kinds of mechanisms and yoga's potential impact. Our final speaker in the panel is Dr. Catherine Cook-Cottone, who's based at the State University of New York at the University at Buffalo. And I welcome you, Dr. Cook-Cottone, to share your slides and begin your presentation.
Can you see my slides okay?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I will be talking about yoga specifically for eating disorders. And the mechanism I'll be talking about is embodiment. So just a quick review of the DSM-5, feeding and eating disorders. These are disorders that involve a persistent disturbance of eating or eating-related behaviors, and they often result in altered consumption or absorption of food and can be very disruptive to overall psychosocial functioning. There's substantial cost. At least 9% of the population worldwide struggles with eating disorders, and it's heritable, and that means that 28 to 74% of risk for eating disorders is passed down genetically, which really, there's so much in this talk that connects with the talks that have already been given. They were the deadliest mental disorder up until this past year, and they've been surpassed by opiate overdose. However, they're still considered very dangerous to have. And about 26% of people with eating disorders attempt suicide. The economic cost has been estimated somewhere around $64 billion a year. And the ones I'll be focusing on here are anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and binge eating disorders. Those are the most common. So this conceptualization looks at positive embodiment as a central kind of a place where we can function in a most integrated way and the healthiest way. And then thinking here almost like centrifugal forces as the stress and other cultural forces act on individuals, and I'll go through some of those factors. We're moved away from being with the body and out toward potentially judging the body or ignoring the body. And then on this spectrum here, restricting food or binge eating food. And when we're judging and binge eating, this results in bulimia nervosa. When we're binge eating and ignoring the body, this is eating in the absence of hunger or binge eating disorder. If we're judging the body and restricting, this manifests as anorexia nervosa. And then food restriction and ignoring the body occurs when there's a lack of response to hunger cues and things like secondary anorexia that we see in depression and anxiety and substance use. And so clinically speaking, and I come from not only as a researcher, but also as a psychologist and a yoga therapist in private practice, that as I work with my patients, what's overwhelming is being in and of and through the body, being embodied. And it's very overwhelming for people at risk or struggling with an eating disorder to connect to the body and all of the sensations and feelings that are part of sitting in your body and not thinking or evaluating and judging. And so an attempt to escape the body and the experience is the kind of drives the eating disorder behavior. So I'm not going to feel my body. I'm not going to be with my body. I'm not going to experience the sensations or feelings. And that actually isn't possible, right? So we have this need to connect to our body, just an inherent need for this connection. And so the eating disorder comes in as this pathological way of connecting to the body. I want to be with my body, but not feel the feelings and sensations. And so the eating disorders come in as this pathological connection to the body. So all of a sudden I am feeling my body, but it's the starvation or it's the intensity of binge eating and purging. So it's a very pathological involvement with the body, but one that allows for connection without the feelings. So treating it can be really difficult. Also, there's this comes from emotionally focused therapy and their model, but looking at people that are extremely sensitive to experiences in their body and the experiences of others. So these are really sensitive nervous systems. And what happens is for those that are especially interoceptively sensitive and then highly sensitive to attunement with others, there can be an abandonment of the interoceptive state or your own body and a focus on modulating the self through your connection with others. And so relationships become very intense. I've had a few patients who could cry and smile at the same time. They're crying due to their internal experience, but then afraid to offend, and so crying and smiling at the same time in an attempt to attune to the parent in the room or even the therapist while also experiencing their own feelings. So this focus outward. I want to honor Kim Sherman, who was one of the first powerful writers on the concepts that I'm talking about, and also Gabriel Maté and his it's a promotion of the Buddhist concept of the hungry ghost, but this notion that when we're misregulated or misdirected in our attempts to connect with the self, we end up like the apparition, the hungry ghost who can never be satisfied because we're attempting to meet our own needs through symptoms, through addiction, through things that will never truly satisfy. And so this is the model I use in my book, but essentially there's a false self, a disordered self that becomes the primary source of regulation, and an actual, true, honest connection between your internal and external experiences is lost. And so what we look for when we're practicing yoga as a pathway to embodiment is the ability to be with your body, your feelings, and your thoughts. And having the tools that are developed through yoga to do that effectively, and then turn outward into the world and connect effectively without losing this connection. So yoga gives us lots of opportunities to practice embodiment. And so embodiment is this way of being with the internal experiences of self, external experiences of self, including cultural influences. and our existential dimensions of life, which is our reasons why we're here and finding meaning and purpose. And you can see already the nice fit for yoga, but this is our subjective sight of self, just acknowledging it doesn't come from thinking, but from being in the body. And then as we work with patients with eating disorders or those at risk, we work from moving away from the body as an object and it's only valuable in terms of how it's assessed or used by others, into it being a resource as we use it as a resource in yoga, to ultimately the automaticity that comes from continued practice where we have a sense of embodiment. So there's a few places I've been exploring this for, gosh, 2 decades now. And so I have some books and also a really cool piece I wrote with Laura Lee Douglas on how do we create a yoga space for those who are at risk for eating disorders. So I'm going to put those resources there for you. But what we look at is this linkage of emotional systems, between the yoga teacher who comes in as this embodied presence, grounded, calm, open, this social engagement system that we've heard about from the other speakers, offering safety, and then the patient who can slowly learn, right, already potentiated for fight, flight, or freeze, actively defensive, to learn how to be in and of their body with attunement, resonance, and reciprocation. So in yoga, there's this powerful linkage of nervous systems as we practice. And then over and over practicing that we're going to be in our bodies and what does that feel like and what's there. And then over and over through each posture, this notion of informed, intentional choice as I move to the next posture, and then practicing a sense of intuition, connection with heart and mind practices. This echoes a few of the presentations today, but it's also active practice in yoga and being with and in this comfort zone, moving to the growth zone where we can start to take on some allostatic load, right? And then knowing when we're overstimulated, and we continually in the yoga practice self-regulate. So we can really get to know this in our body so we can use it not only on the mat, but out in the world as we use the tools of grounding and breathing to regulate. So our goal in yoga is practicing this intentional mobilization and immobilization of the body in service of our own self-regulation. So not in reaction to the stress out there, but that we move through this process in our practice. So again, this article, we look at what is needed in the yoga space to make that happen. And you're going to I have a folder here for you. It'll be available in the slides right here. That'll have that article and then our special issue. And I'll close with a quick review of the special issue, but you will be able to access this drive and there's PDFs of all the articles of our special issue here for you. We wanted to be really honest about our background and our interest. And so my colleagues, Diane Newmark-Stainer, Tracy Tilka, and Ann Cox all talk about our own history with embodiment, disordered eating, and our interest in yoga as our introduction, to introduce our bias as we enter it, and also to acknowledge it and then address it in the research. There are 2 articles available that are about the conceptual notion of embodiment and how yoga works, both myself and Iris Perry from Germany, and then Neva Perron in Toronto and Diane Newmark-Stainer that review the links to embodiment in yoga. And then this is just a quick summary of what happens in embodiment and how yoga can play a role. But it really is that experience of the body as the source of lived experience. It's the home of sensing and sensuality. And then in eating disorders, we want to give the body, create a space that the body can really truly be the home where no need to escape. A really wonderful article in this special issue is written by Jennifer Webb and her colleagues. And she talks about the issues with inclusion in yoga. And she does a wonderful job of talking about who has access and who doesn't, and also the really critical history of yoga in activism and changes culturally, going all the way back to its role in India and colonization. So I encourage you to read that article. And then Ann Cox and Tracy Tilka take time and explore all the potential mechanisms, including many of the mechanisms described today, in the role of yoga in addressing the vulnerabilities that are present in eating disorders. And here's a graphic from their article, and you can see that there's the yoga context, there's demographics, but what yoga allows here, the practice, are these experiences of body embodiment during the practice that help us move from creating states of embodiment to really helping people develop the traits that are consistent with being positively embodied, like a trait of self-compassion, a trait of mindfulness. So as we practice state mindfulness, we can develop it over the repeated experiences, help it become a trait that then results in just a different vulnerability to eating disorders. This is an example of one of the RCTs that's described in the special issue. And in this one, we really looked at what happens if we teach yoga about, like body sculpting and do a lot of what we would call like diet talk in yoga versus just calling poses or mindfulness-based yoga instruction. And here in our RCT, we found that there was substantial risk provided when we teach doing a more diet talk and body slimming type of instruction versus a mindfulness approach. And that's an example of some of the awful cues we gave during the diet condition. And then the last part is this, the meta-analysis that I conducted with one of my students, Ashley Borden. So we reviewed a total of 43 studies that were all on yoga and eating disorders with 11 trials involving 754 participants. Overall, we are very excited to find small, significant effect on global eating disorder psychopathology, a moderate to large effect on binge eating and bulimia, a small effect on body image concerns, and no significant effect on restriction or dieting, but it would be restricting food intake. And we were excited about that in terms of there is some concern that yoga may increase restraint, and it doesn't. So we're looking to hopefully see what we can pair up yoga with to address this as well, which may be exposure to food. And then last, a small to moderate effect on eating disorder related constructs. So I'm closing with one of my favorite little poems, but I said to my body softly, I want to be your friend. It took a long, deep breath and replied, I have been waiting my whole life for this. And so that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Cook-Cottone, for that inspiring talk and a real in-depth view of the psychology of embodiment and how yoga positively impacts that. So the panel is now open for questions. And so I ask the conference hosts to pose any questions that have been put together from the audience for our speakers.
I have a question. Could I ask a question, Sabir?
Yes, please go ahead.
This is for Dr. Dada. So I loved your talk, and it's been a while since I've done reproductive health. My recollection is that the eggs in females are kind of, you have what you have and they don't really change. And the sperm in males are renewed pretty frequently. And I'm wondering if that's why most of the research has been done in males, because there's an ability to affect the epigenetic markers.
Definitely, it's more easy to study sperm because we are able to get them easily. And ethically, to get ova is very difficult, though we did a study on the mitochondrial DNA, but those were ova which were of poor quality. The other thing is the ova is brought out in an environment which is rather safe and it doesn't divide. And it has a complete repair mechanism. So and the only problem it suffers is because when it is going to divide during meiosis, that is delayed. And that time, because the ATP levels are lower, they sometimes undergo disjunction errors. So chromosomal abnormalities occur in the oocyte. However, there is a concept that the father can have a child at any age, be it 90, 95, and there are men who have fathered children at 93 years. But it's important to remember that beyond 30 years, the sperm starts accumulating damage. And that damage is, because the sperm is having a higher number of mitochondrial mutations because of oxidative damage, unhealthy lifestyle, and it's not able to clear the damage. So it depends upon the oocyte. And when the couple has, delay having a child, the oocytes repair mechanisms are also suboptimal. And therefore the damage tends to, persist. And therefore the concept is now really shifting. Rather from the mother, now they're focusing on the father, because the sperm quality you can actually improve if you lead a healthy lifestyle. So so that has actually resulted in this concept of paternal origin of health and disease.
I have another question. I'm allowed.
Let's take some questions from the audience, and then we'll circle back if we have time.
Fine.
I see one in the chat. There's asking when I was talking
hosts, are you planning to read this question? We cannot hear you at the moment.
Yes, I'll read the question for Dr. Catherine. When you speak of yoga for positive embodiment, which specific...
mental health. The Hatha Yoga viewpoint, Sadak Badak Tattva Jansanga Paratyaga, therefore staying away from people crowds. What is the disconnect? Why did Hatha Yoga propose it? I'm assuming this is India specific. Dr. Dada, do you know what, do you have an answer for that?
I really did not understand what they're trying to get at. I didn't get it.
Okay. Well, in case someone has insights, they can chime in. It's a question for Dr. Catherine Cook-Cottone. When you speak of yoga for positive embodiment, which specific techniques are you employing? Asana, pranayama, meditation?
So the research studies typically have focused on asana, and then the pranayama, breath work, and meditation and relaxation. So those four are the primary foci of the studies. When I'm working in private practice, I do also focus on those four. And in particular for patients with eating disorders, an entryway is often asana, because they're so caught in their heads that that sitting quietly for meditation can be overwhelming. The eating disorder thoughts come in. So doing asana work, and sometimes kind of active asana work, can be a pathway in. And the good news with our research is many people feared that would cause a decrease in BMI, and we're just not finding that in the research. So they're able to exercise, practice being in their bodies in a bit of a meditative movement, right? Practicing being embodied and not being overwhelmed by thoughts because they're focused on the movement and posture. So there's an emphasis on asana.
Dr. Khalsa, can I just on the side?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so they say that one of the doctors here said that we should engage socially, and and I think nowadays they do say that loneliness is one of the main factors which is resulting in increase in the mental health disorders. But they say here that the Hatha Yoga propounds that we should try to remain away from people and crowds. I think that would just be so that we can focus more and meditate and go inwards. But I think we have to maintain a balance. That's what I think.
Thank you for that. Another question for Dr. Catherine Cook-Cottone. Why is that people with highly sensitive nervous system develop eating disorder? Can you share some ways to deal with the sensitivity?
Yeah, so what can happen for people who are at risk for eating disorders is when, let's say, somebody in the room is upset, they will feel that upsetness in their body. If somebody's sad, they feel the sadness. So the eating disorder symptoms end up being a way, a lot like in substance use, where if somebody uses, they become more numb. It's a way of numbing out the nervous system, and then also distraction, so that they're not so influenced by the other individuals or cultural factors. So it's a way of focusing on the self, but a very disordered way. So when you teach people how to be in their bodies in a really functional way and say, oh, I'm noticing, right, that someone in the room is upset, we develop the witness that we would develop during the practices, right? And that while I'm noticing that and I'm noticing the feeling in my own body, I can ground my feet. I can take some deep breaths, roll my shoulders onto my back, right? Do some deep belly breathing, self-regulate, and then have a solid sense that their emotions will arise and pass, my experience will arise and pass, and I don't need to have symptoms in order to negotiate that experience.
Dr. Streeter, go ahead and ask your question.
So this is again for Dr. Dada. You commented on lifestyle choices. I heard you talk about pranayama, meditation, and diet. And I didn't hear you talk about asanas. And I do want to know if you consider asanas and whether diet is actually an important component of what you're talking about when you're talking about the data, because it's that's one of the issues with yoga. Is when they say yoga, it's like, what is that exactly?
So when I talk of yoga, I mean both the asanas, pranayam, and meditation. But we are also counseling the patient that yoga is just not on the mat, it's an entire lifestyle. As I said, it's an art of living. So we tell them to have, avoid processed foods, sugary, starchy foods. We focus on whole plant-based foods. So that's what I said, where this, if people follow this part, then they would also be having a more nutritious diet, which is more nutrient dense versus calorie dense diet, which would also decrease the burden of mental health disorders. So that's what I was trying to link up with.
Thank you.
I have a question that can be addressed by both Dr. Dada and Dr. Streeter, being experts in yoga treatment for depression. Dr. Dada, you had this remarkable study where you took patients who were resistant to efficacy of pharmaceutical treatment and found that many of those would be effectively treated by yoga. I mean, this seems to be very significant that modern medicine has no cure for these patients, and yet yoga can come in and possibly give relief. Can you expound on those results and the significance of that?
Actually, I think modern medicine fails at several steps because though it is useful, definitely, but we've seen that it takes time for the patients to reach remission, for us to see the effects of antidepressant drugs. But then there are so many numerous side effects and the compliance is poor and then they develop, relapses. But yoga is not only improving compliance, but is also helping to build up emotional resilience, and the patients are able to, as you saw, the people even with the susceptibility genotypes are showing more improvement versus the group which is just on the antidepressants. So, and the most important thing is, and when we are giving cognitive behavioral therapy or we are just giving drugs, they're just targeting the mind, and the depression is a mind-body disorder. So we need to give this, holistic approach to tackle this disorder.
So I would add that there are a number of studies where people who are on antidepressants and were still depressed, where then yoga was added to the regime and they got better. And so I think that, everything should be brought to bear. And then there are other examples of people who were on antidepressants and then added yoga and then could come off their antidepressants. So I wouldn't say antidepressants are bad, but I think that yoga really should be like a first line response if people are not completely better. Or it should be part of a whole treatment strategy from the get-go, as opposed to, we'll add it maybe as an afterthought. And then for maintenance, it's certainly, it is a lifestyle issue. So you're supposed to do it every day. And that helps maintain people from relapsing, because depression is a relapsing disorder.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that the whole concept of yoga as a first-line treatment has a lot of merit. We see that in behavioral treatment for insomnia, which is now considered to be a first-line treatment, and then pharmaceuticals can be a backup if that doesn't work. So now I'd like to sort of just give a brief summary of our panel. I think that if you were a scientist 20 years ago and saw the presentations that we saw on the panel, you would be stunned. You would be stunned at the degree to which we have come to an understanding of the systems and mechanisms that that are benefiting from yoga with respect to mental health. And I think one of the cores is really the effects of yoga on self-regulation of the stress system, the autonomic nervous system, the HPA axis, and its role in that, and the central role of that in producing all of the other negative mental health problems that are there. And the number of systems that we've seen discussed, the effects on the reproductive system, on the sperm, on cognitive functioning, emotion regulation, on eating behavior. It's really stunning to see the broad impact that yoga has across these systems. We've also seen in these presentations a lot of the neurophysiology that we're coming to understand, the role of the prefrontal cortex, the insula, the amygdala, and the work of networks, how yoga is impacting brain networks and that's impact on behavior. And then even more fine grained, looking at neurohormones and neurotransmitters, the role of cortisol, catecholamines, Dr. Streeter's wonderful work with GABA, the effects on BDNF and other molecules that are impacting mental health and behavior. And then finally, even more fine grained, the remarkable work on gene expression, the effects on subcellular processes, on telomeres, looking at damage to the DNA, mitochondrial integrity. This is really phenomenal that we're now starting to see that yoga is not just working at the gross level, but it's working at the level of our cells and molecules. That's how deeply yoga penetrates us as humans who practice these techniques. So I think our presenters are really at the forefront of this kind of research, and it's really inspiring to see the future of yoga for mental health through all of these kinds of studies. So I thank again the panelists for their wonderful presentations and the audience for some of their insightful questions and for their participation, and thank the organizers again for choosing this excellent topic of yoga for mental health. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And our chair for their deep scientific presentations. Your research work is truly very inspiring. We take special thanks to our speakers. We give special thanks to our speakers in Massachusetts. We believe you had to wake up early at 5 a.m. to deliver this presentation for us, but that's the time that we ought to wake up, I believe. That's the Brahma Muhurta, and as a yoga sadhak, that is what is prescribed. So once again, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rima, as well, for joining us. We now have a short break, and we'll meet again in this hall for our Tratak session with Mrs. Sandhya Dikshitji. We also have Swami Anubhavanandji's session. It's happening simultaneously in the Vashisht Hall, so those of you who'd like to proceed there, you may do so. Our online participants, I would like to request them to have a candle and a matchbox ready. And if the candle can be placed at a height appropriate at your eye level and about 1 arm's distance from you, then it'll be easy to begin the session as well.
I also request the group leaders to please meet CG Shinde sir at the registration desk. All the group leaders, please meet Shinde sir at registration desk. Thank you.